Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Talk Dairy to Me, Facts, Fiction, and FAQs. I'm Sally Cummins, Vice President of Nutrition Affairs with National Dairy Council. We have a lot to cover today, but before we get started, I just wanted to share a few housekeeping details. If you're having any tech or sound issues, just contact Zoom support, which you'll be able to link to in the link in the chat. And if you have questions for today's speakers, please drop those in the Q&A window, and we'll address as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar. Since kicking off National Dairy Council's webinar series 5 years ago, we have received thousands of questions from health and wellness professionals. And in the spirit of National Dairy Month, which starts today, we've consolidated some of the most common questions related to dairy and health, farming, and sustainability. And we've invited some of the leading experts in dairy to help us determine fact from fiction. I am thrilled to introduce our panel who will be talking dairy to us today. Abbey Copenhaver is a registered dietitian and a dairy farmer. Abbey farms with her husband and 3 other families in the Finger Lakes region of New York. She is also the owner of Farmstead Nutrition and Consulting, focusing on agricultural food production and family nutrition, and she teaches at Finger Lakes Community College. Abbey earned a bachelor's degree in animal science from Cornell University, as well as a bachelor's in human nutrition and dietetics from the Buffalo State College. But she didn't stop there. She went on to receive a master's degree in agricultural and food science and management from Washington State University. We're also joined by Megan Maisano. Megan is a registered dietitian nutritionist and the director of nutrition and regulatory affairs at National Dairy Council. She holds a BS in psychology from the United States Military Academy at West Point and an MS in nutrition communications from Tufts University Friedman School, and completed her dietetic internship at the Cleveland Clinic. And rounding out today's panel of speakers is Dr. Stephanie Masiello Schuette. Dr. Masiello Schuette is a multidisciplined scientist with a background in disease surveillance, dairy science, food science, epidemiology, and communication methodology. She completed her master's degree in dairy science from Virginia Tech and her PhD in dairy food safety from Cornell University. And she currently serves as the director of environmental research at Dairy Management Incorporated. Sharing the disclosures for today's speakers and the planning team, as well as today's learning objectives and suggested CDR performance indicators. But before we dive into fact versus fiction portion, it's important to start with why we're here and why this topic is relevant from a public health perspective. As we know, there's room for improvement in the American diet. And you can see on the left that our healthy index eating scores are not ideal, and regardless of age or life stage rather. And from the statistics on the right, you can see that most Americans can improve their diets by consuming more whole grains, vegetables, dairy foods, and fruit. Unfortunately, poor diets are taking a toll on our health and contributing to heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and overweight and obesity. Nutrition and lifestyle behaviors are also linked to our bone and muscular health as we age, which can also have considerable impact on our quality of life. And we know that dairy foods as part of a healthy diet can help reduce risk and burden of chronic disease, particularly cardiometabolic health outcomes, as you can see here on the slide. And they serve as a foundational role of the 3 healthy eating patterns in the dietary guidelines. Dietary guidelines, healthy eating patterns. But people still have questions, which is why we're here today. And we collected common questions, comments, and requests and put together this webinar as a tool for you to better understand what the science says when it comes to dairy topics so you can feel confident in your practice. So let's go ahead and get started. Megan, let's kick things off with a few nutrition and health related topics. So fact or fiction? People with lactose intolerance need to avoid all dairy foods.
Thanks, Sally. I really appreciate this question and think it's a good one to kick off the section with. First and foremost, I think it's important to emphasize that lactose intolerance is a real condition that affects many Americans. It's also highly individual. Reported symptoms and the dose of tolerance can vary significantly between people. So it's important that we as healthcare providers validate every patient's concerns and unique experience. As many of us know, lactose intolerance is the inability to digest lactose, which leads to uncomfortable GI symptoms when it remains intact and passes into our large intestine. And this is different from milk protein allergy, where symptoms reflect an immune response rather than lactose malabsorption. The estimated prevalence of lactose intolerance in the US is about 36%. That's more than 1 out of every 3 people. Furthermore, genetics and ethnicity play a significant role. You can see from the statistics here that people of color, Ashkenazi Jews, and Native Americans and Alaskans are much more likely to experience lactose intolerance than people of European descent. And these differences by race are also important because as many of us know, people of color in the US experience both health disparities and healthcare inequities, which brings me to my next point. Next slide. So lactose intolerance doesn't necessarily have to mean no more dairy in the diet. Sally, as you mentioned earlier, dairy intake is associated with reduced risk of several chronic diseases. So it's important to know that there are no to low lactose options for those who seek them. The National Medical Association has really spearheaded this topic. For those of you who don't know, NMA is a national organization that represents Black physicians and their patients and are advocates for justice in medicine. Over the last 20 years, they produced multiple reports about the importance of awareness and education on lactose-friendly dairy options in the diets of Black Americans in an effort to reduce the risk of common nutrition deficiencies and chronic disease. So it's important for us as clinicians to know that there are a variety of options available right in the supermarket. And so this slide shows the spectrum of lactose content from 0 and lactose-free milk, which is real milk with the same nutrients, just without the lactose, to up to 12 grams of lactose found in normal dairy milk. You can see that some cheeses, cottage cheese, and Greek yogurt have less natural lactose due to the cheese making and straining process, as well as the influence of live and active cultures, which help us digest the lactose. And so knowing and educating these options can be a viable way to help people enjoy dairy and its nutritional benefits with confidence. Lastly, for some folks, lactose intolerance can really turn them off from dairy foods, and that might be reason enough to avoid dairy altogether, including lactose-free options. And at the end of the day, that's okay. As healthcare providers, we can educate on lactose-free and low lactose options, and if they choose to exclude dairy, then we should acknowledge and respect their decision, and then help them choose other food sources that can fill in those nutrient gaps in their overall diet. And for times when we don't have the exact lactose numbers in front of us, here are 6 tried and true tips to help with lactose digestion, because let's face it, guidance that isn't practical just isn't sustainable. These strategies actually stem from NMA's work as well. So if you're working with people who experience lactose intolerance, you can encourage them to try lactose-free dairy options, try stirring it in or mixing it with other foods like cereal, to shred or slice cheeses, to spoon yogurt with its helpful cultures, and to start small and build slowly. Oops. There we go.
Thanks, Megan. I think also, there's lactase enzymes, tablets and drops that can be helpful as well. So thank you for that. It actually links really nicely to our next question about dairy alternatives, which comes up a lot for people with lactose intolerance. So should plant-based milks be considered a replacement for dairy milk?
Great question. And it's an important one for sure. Walk past any dairy case in the store these days, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed with all the options out there. I think a helpful place to start is to briefly talk about what dairy milk is and what it offers. So milk provides way more than just calcium and vitamin D. 1 8-ounce glass offers a good or excellent source of 13 essential nutrients, including 3 of the 4 of public health concern for the US, which we know are the nutrients that the majority of us don't consume enough of that can impact our health. And on top of that, dairy milk is exceptionally affordable at just about 20 cents per serving. In fact, studies show that dollar for dollar, dairy foods are one of the most economical sources of nutrition in our diets. The table on the left shows the most affordable foods for the 4 nutrients of public health concern. You can see that dairy foods like milk and cheese are among the least expensive sources of calcium, vitamin D, and potassium. And this is important because food insecurity remains a significant public health issue in our country, affecting 13.5 million households, many of which have children. Because dairy foods are affordable, accessible, and quite versatile, they make pretty important contributions to our diet and often fill in nutrient gaps. For example, milk not only offers a good or excellent source of those 3 nutrients of public health concern for kids, but for kids, it's actually the leading food source of those nutrients. And for all Americans, including adults, dairy foods also make other notable contributions as well, as you can see on the right. And this is why many authoritative health bodies and guidelines underscore dairy as a nutritious part of a healthy dietary pattern. I won't go into all the details on this slide because we'll address them throughout the presentation, but it's helpful to know that even beyond the dietary guidelines, expert organizations like the AAP, FAO, and American Heart Association all recommend dairy foods. So getting back to your original question, Sally, dairy alternatives are, well, they're just different. They can absolutely be a part of a healthy dietary pattern, but when you look at their nutritional profiles, most shouldn't be considered, quote unquote, swaps for dairy milk, with the exception of fortified soy beverage, which the dietary guidelines identify as the only non-dairy alternative that's considered to be equivalent nutrition-wise. This slide shows a few things to consider when comparing the two. First, dairy milk consists of, just milk, along with fortified vitamin D. Whole milk offers vitamin A, but when the fat is removed, it's often lost alongside with it. So you'll normally see low fat and fat-free milks are fortified with vitamin A as well. And as I mentioned before, it offers 13 nutrients, including high-quality protein and bioactive components as a part of its food matrix. And as we know, the nutrition and ingredients of plant-based beverages can vary widely based on the product or the brand. So it's important to help educate people on reading the label. Many plant-based options contain additives, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? So, food additives can be useful to improve taste, texture, appearance, and safety. But knowing the ingredients is important, and it can help empower consumers to make informed choices. Plant-based beverage nutritional profiles often depend on the fortification, but many tend to be lower in natural protein, with the exception of soy beverage, and many are also lower in energy and fat content. So again, dairy alternatives are simply different beverage choices. While they offer a similar consistency and culinary use to dairy milk, it's important for us as nutrition professionals to help educate people about how they're considerably different from a nutritional lens. And so these nutritional differences, as well as the variability in plant-based alternatives, are the reason why they're generally not recommended for growing children who need those very specific nutrients, calories, and fat for their growing brains, bones, and bodies. According to the consensus statement of the healthy beverage consumption and early childhood, which was developed by an expert panel consisting of the AAP, American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the American Heart Association, and the American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry, the only two recommended beverages for children ages 1 to 5 are water and plain pasteurized dairy milk. That's it. I like it. Keeping it simple. All right, so these recommendations are important because unfortunately, swapping dairy milk for plant-based alternatives can have unintended nutritional consequences. This modeling study from Australia was just published in April, and it explored what would happen if dairy milk was swapped with plant-based imitation products. This chart on the slide shows the estimated % change in mean daily intake of nutrients if dairy milk was replaced. And what they found was nutrients already at risk for inadequate intake, such as iodine, vitamin B12, would likely be adversely impacted, as you can see here shaded in red and pink. This is particularly concerning during pregnancy and lactation, as well as early childhood, due to potential impact on neurocognitive development, as well as for older adults who don't absorb vitamin B12 as well.
Thanks, Megan. That's really an impactful study. Thank you for sharing that with us. Speaking of early childhood, we sometimes hear, and even got it in some of the registration comments for this webinar, that milk is just for kids and calcium and bone health, and it isn't relevant for adults. So what do you think of that? Fact or fiction?
Yeah, so I hear this a lot too. First, let's not discount dairy's OG status as an important food for bone health. As I mentioned earlier, for kids ages 2 to 18, milk is the leading food source of bone-building calcium, vitamin D, and potassium. Those nutrients, along with its protein, zinc, phosphorus, magnesium, they all play an important role. There's a reason why it's recommended by folks such as the AAP, NIH, and dietary guidelines, specifically to help achieve peak bone mass. And this is important because diet and lifestyle habits during childhood and adolescence can impact our bone health when we're older. A nice way to educate parents on this is to consider it like building a bone bank. Dairy's unique nutrient bundle calcium, vitamin D, phosphorus, magnesium, and zinc. They all contribute to achieving peak bone mass during that critical window of time when it matters most, and it can help reduce the risk of osteoporosis later in life. But let's go beyond bones. Did you know that dairy's nutrients are also critical for early brain development too? Talk about something that gets a parent's ears perking, right? And I know, as a mom myself, I'm guilty of it too. If there's a way I can boost my toddler's brain development, I'm all for it. I'm a sucker for it. In its policy statement advocating for nutrition in the first 1,000 days, the AAP recognized 14 nutrients that affect early brain development. And as you can see here on the slide in the green boxes, dairy foods provide 7 of those 14 nutrients. In particular, it's an excellent source of iodine, which is the leading cause of preventable intellectual disability worldwide. So if you work with pregnant or lactating people or young children, dairy foods can be an easy and affordable way to obtain these important brain-building nutrients. All right, so now let's talk beyond childhood. Milk and dairy foods offer a lot of functional benefits at all life stages. While I promise I won't go through this entire slide, you can see the unique nutrients and bioactive components in dairy foods are positively linked with muscular health and body composition, digestive and bone health, brain function and potentially sleep, and cardiometabolic health and immune function. And another potential benefit of dairy foods is that they can have anti-inflammatory effects. And this is important because for some reason, the dairy and inflammation myth continues to live on, and I'm not exactly sure why. You can see from this slide, there is plenty of evidence from meta-analyses and systematic reviews over the last 10 years that show dairy is not inflammatory, but may have beneficial anti-inflammatory effects. And these neutral to positive effects were found regardless of dairy fat content or participant health status. And that's important because, as I touched upon earlier, dairy foods can contribute really important and affordable nutrients, but misinformation can lead to unnecessarily restricting it from our diet.
All right, Megan, thank you. Last question for you. Fact or fiction? Full fat or whole milk dairy products should be avoided.
Yes, I love this topic, and it's something that I, like many of us, have seen trending in research, podcasts, and headlines. So first, let's talk about dairy's food matrix. It's important to remember that we eat food and not individual nutrients. And this is important from an educational and biochemical perspective. When we talk about a food matrix, we're talking about the complex matrices of nutrients, bioactives, food structures, prebiotics, probiotics, and other components. These interactions all affect how we digest, absorb, and metabolize food, and therefore, and what research is showing, can have an effect on health and disease outcomes. The dairy fat matrix in particular has a unique bioactive component that can positively influence our health. Honestly, we could do a whole webinar on this, and we actually have in the past. But to be brief, the table on the right highlights milk's bioactive components like peptides, lipids, the milk fat globule membrane, and the different carbohydrates, and their potential role in things like blood pressure, glucose control, decreased cholesterol absorption, gut health, and increased calcium absorption. And these mechanisms may explain the unique paradox between dairy fat and cardiometabolic risk. Research shows full-fat dairy foods exhibit a protective effect for chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease and mortality, type 2 diabetes, stroke, hypertension, and overweight and obesity. This body of evidence is super exciting, but still emerging. So yeah, perhaps we still have much more to learn when it comes to dairy's saturated fat and the unique effects on the food matrix.
All right, Megan, thank you so much for offering your insights and perspective. We're going to shift gears and hear from Abbey Copenhaver, who brings the unique perspective as a dairy farmer and a dietitian. So Abbey, fact or fiction? This is one we get quite a bit. Is organic dairy better than conventional dairy?
Yeah, so that actually is fiction, but it's a question I get a lot. So I appreciate you asking, Sally. So back to our organic versus conventional dairy foods or our non-organic. So you can rest assured, no matter what dairy foods you are finding in the store, that it has that great nutritional package that Megan went through a lot when she was answering her questions. So that 13 essential nutrients, all of our milk, no matter if you're having non-organic or organic or anything in between, it's 13 essential nutrients, and all of our farmers are committed to care for our cows and our land and working with a business that has a sustainability component, and everything is regulated and inspected. The real difference, if you are purchasing dairy with a USDA organic seal on it, is that they're following that extra program. So there's going to be those extra steps, such as purchasing certain fertilizers, a pasture grazing requirement, organic feeds, no antibiotic use, and those products tend to be UHT or ultra high temperature, just because those products don't move as quickly. So it provides a longer shelf life, which is great because it reduces food waste. So really, it's just referring to the farming method. So when you're purchasing something that's organic, or we'll see in our next slide, that's referring to the method of farming. So when we talked about everything in between, there's other dairy products we see in the store that have different marketing or nutrition labels on it, right? And we get all these questions. Does it change the nutrition? So you might say things like grass-fed or maybe fortified with omega-3s. The tough thing about these ones is that they're not actually federally regulated. So again, you can rest assured they still have those same great 13 essential nutrients in it, but the milk composition can change with some of these factors, such as heavier grazing than others or the cow's breed. So the big thing you want to focus on is if you're seeking milk for those 13 essential nutrients, you can feel safe and free to purchase any brand you would like. But if you're really trying to seek a source for specific omega-3s or something else, you want to make sure it's fortified or it's a different source like salmon, because these different grazing requirements could be different depending on the certification the farm's using. And if it is higher, it's not going to be high enough that causes that health claim that you're wanting with a higher consumption of omega-3s. So you just want to be able to remember that. And then I'm going to have Sally ask our next question here.
Thanks, Abby. And I think, what you just shared right there just makes me think that regardless of what type of dairy milk you're choosing, they all provide the same 13 nutrients. So it's kind of up to your personal choice and preference. But you can be rest assured that they are fully nutritious. So this is the other one we get frequently when it comes to dairy milk products. And we hear questions about hormones and antibiotics found in milk. So can you walk us through this a little bit? It does get a little complicated, and I think your background would be really helpful for folks.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. So this one, again, is actually fiction. So I do get these questions a lot because I wear that hat of dairy farmer and dietitian. So I'd love to provide these expertise and kind of shed light on this. So hormones are commonly misunderstood and sometimes seen in a negative light, but really when we look at the science of what a hormone is, it's a chemical messenger, right? For a living organism to be able to communicate with different systems throughout the body. So whether that's a plant or a human being or an animal, everybody has hormones so that they can, maybe the simplest comparison is send the other part of the body a text message or an email to be able to communicate. So that's really what hormones are. And they're made up of a protein. So if you are consuming plants or animals, it's really going to be digested like a protein. So when people ask questions about, are there hormones in milk? We always say yes, because if it's a living organism, you're going to have hormones in there. So it's the same if you consume a plant or if you're consuming animal products. The hormone we get a lot of questions about is the bovine somatotropin. So that's naturally produced within the cow. And it was something that we created a synthetic form of to be able to help the cow out, because it's meant to help regulate her metabolism and her negative and positive energy balance. And we noticed with some cows, through different transitions of life, they benefited from getting a dose here and there of that. So they weren't on it all the time. But because of the misconception and miseducation out there surrounding this technology, it was actually driven out of the market. So you can't actually test for it. So it's a really a farmer's pledge that no farmers out there are producing milk utilizing the synthetic form. But because cows naturally produce it, it is going to be in your milk. So if you see those claims still on your dairy products that say it's made without synthetic, the RBST or things like that, you're also going to see a claim attached to it saying that there's no science showing that there's adverse effects, because really the reason we don't use it anymore isn't because it's not a good technology. It's because consumers basically have driven it out of the market for us to use it on our farms. So when we talk antibiotics, Again, I want to just start right off the bat with saying that there is no food you're going to buy in the store with antibiotics in it. So especially with your dairy products. So you don't have to worry about that at all. And again, that's across the board with dairy products. It doesn't matter what method of farming they're using. You're not going to buy or go to the store having to worry that there could be antibiotics in your milk or your yogurt or your cheese. So with farmers, there's a high incentive to in checkpoints along the way to make sure that that doesn't happen. One, we're consumers too. There's a lot of integrity wrapped up in our livelihood of producing this product that we rely on for income. And then that business side of the incentive is it's our income, right? So milk is what we rely on to make money. So if we aren't able to sell that milk, so if it tests positive for antibiotics and it has to be dumped, we're not getting paid. And then also sometimes there's other additional fines associated with that as well. So if we look at the numbers, right, because the numbers talk, when we take our milk to the milk plants, we have tankers that you'll see in our next picture. And before those tankers are unloaded, they test them for antibiotics. So that's what these numbers represent right here. So, and the ones that tested positive, which you can see is a super, super small, minute amount actually was dumped. So again, this isn't the amount saying, hey, this is what ended up in the stores. This is saying out of all the milk production in the United States, this is what ended up positive that they had to dump before it went into the plant. So in this tanker right here, these are the stuff you might see on the road. This is where they pump it onto the truck. It's refrigerated. And I always like to use this example. So one of these tankers holds 70,000 pounds of milk or 8,100 gallons. So if you had one cow that had to have antibiotics because she wasn't feeling well and she makes 75 pounds of milk and she was, you know, for some reason it got into here, you're talking that milk is being diluted down to about a 0.1%. So not 1%, 0.1%. And a test would still pick up that antibiotic. So those tests are very, very sensitive. And as we go along, I have a really cool infographic here. I actually did farm tours yesterday. So farm tours about milk from cow to ewe is very fresh in my mind. So just to walk through the steps so you guys can really see where we have our checkpoints to make sure that there's no antibiotics. So our cows are milked. It's put into a tank on the farm to kept refrigerated. It is tested before it is pumped onto the truck for antibiotics. And then again, when it gets to the plant, it's tested before that tanker is even unloaded at that plant. So there's several steps to make sure that that doesn't happen. It's also tested for certain quality standards as well, so that once it's inside the plant, the FDA Code of Federal Regulations has certain standardization for when they do dairy products. So they do that, and then it's pasteurized. It's usually some form of temperature and time, depending on the product. It could be a different method of pasteurization. And then if it is bottled, it would go on to be homogenized so that it doesn't separate for you guys when you go to get it at the store. So everything our farmers do, we try to make sure that it is safe and the best quality for those 13 essential nutrients for you guys.
Thank you, Abby. You know, speaking of farm to table process, something many of us hear a lot is that the food system is broken. Stephanie, I'd love to get your expertise and insight on this topic.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. Thank you. And I'm going to give you the scientist answer of it's complicated, right? So Dr. Adam Janowski, who's a well-known expert in kind of obesity work and social disparities of health, said that the food supply really needs to provide foods that are healthy, safe, affordable, culturally acceptable, and a low impact on the environment. And when we look at food systems, they're extremely complex and multifaceted. If you guys will nerd out with me for a second, that's why researchers who actually study different types of decisions call the food system a wicked problem, because it is so complicated. So for this, really, when we think about a sustainable food system, we're looking at facets that have to do with health. We're looking at facets having to do with an impact on the environment. We're looking at those social impacts as well, whether it's cultural, regional behaviors, even delving into social justice, as well as economics, really looking at that food supply and demand. And kind of before we go further into the food systems discussion, Bear with me as I pull from my public health past here, but just a quick side note to make sure that we all align when we talk, and I mention the terms equality and equity, that we know what they mean. So here you can see in this picture, inequality is that we've got a tree leaning, right? The fruit falls to one side. Equality means that everybody is getting the same tool. So everyone got the same size ladder. That's really only helpful for one person here. When we talk about equity, it's meeting people where they are. And you can see that now people have ladders that are appropriate for their situation, and they're able to actually reach the fruit. Ideally, in any system, whether it's complex, a wicked problem or not, the hope is justice, where you're actually fixing the actual issue. And you can see here in that last box that we actually have made the tree more upright. So thinking about what makes a food system successful, I want to pull from this really awesome paper from 2019. And what these researchers did is they asked experts, why is our food system broken? Right? Because that's something that we hear a lot. So these experts gave their thoughts. And what these researchers did is said, okay, if these are reasons why it's broken, then these must be criteria that the food system needs to have to be successful. And you can kind of see them here. They broke it down very nicely. A successful food system needs to have the ability to feed the current and future population. It needs to have the ability to deliver a healthy diet. It needs to be able to produce equal and equitable benefits. And we need to understand the sustainability of the system and its impact on the environment. Something really important to remember when we talk about foods within the food system is that no food is going to be 100% in every category, right? It is the part that it's because of the system, there are trade-offs. So I always use the example of sugar. Do we currently have enough sugar to feed the current population and probably the future one? Yes. Do most people have access to sugar? Yes. Do we have an understanding of what the environmental impacts of sugar are in certain places? Yes. Ability to deliver a healthy diet, right? That would probably be this group up for discussion of where it's important versus not. So again, you can kind of see when you put different foods in here, the trade-offs that come up. And really, all of these characteristics relate to core fields, whether that's food security, nutrition security or health, social justice and governance, as well as environmental aspects. And really, the goal of a successful food system is to help close yield gaps, to ensure the quality of a diet, right, by closing nutrient gaps, making sure that folks have access, and ultimately reducing the footprint on the system on the environment. And really, dairy can actually play a role in each pillar. So when we think about closing yield gaps, you heard Megan speak to that earlier about being affordable and accessible. Nutrient gaps, we also heard, right, with the 13 nutrients and part of being a healthy dietary pattern. For access gaps, not only do a lot of people have access to this nutritious food, but dairy contributes significantly to jobs in the US economy and even supports a ton of livelihoods around the globe. And as far as reducing the footprint of the system on the environment, we have life cycle assessments that have been done. I'll probably talk about that later, as well as really targeting certain efficiencies so that we actually can minimize that impact.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stephanie. You know, one of the reasons I love my job is that we get to work with multidisciplinary experts, and so many experts bringing their expertise and talents to the team, and we get to have daily conversations about things like this. So as nutrition and health experts, it's helpful to be familiar with the bigger picture and appreciate the complexity of each domain of sustainability. And while we're on the topic of sustainability, Abby, I'd love to hear your expertise on the next topic. So many people may not be familiar with what modern farming looks like these days and have concerns about things like animal care and environmental sustainability. Can you talk to us a little bit about what dairy farms look like and what farmers are doing on this front?
Yeah, so as we can see here, we see that number, right? That 1% of the population feeds 100%. And we're finding with people being more degrees away from agriculture that they want to experience their food more than just tasting it. So they want to know how it's made, where it comes from. So I actually usually commonly ask people, whether I'm in a group setting or one-on-one, have you ever been to a dairy farm before? Or have you ever been to any farm? Because being able to, they talk about different forms of learning, right? There's nothing better than that interactive learning component. So if somebody has been to a farm, you can almost tell through that conversation because you just learn so much and you think through things differently. So with our dairy farmers, there's so many different facets that you have to consider, right? Because we're using land and we're taking care of animals. So there's a lot of pieces of environment that come to play. And we have to take every piece into consideration and not only say, hey, how can we make sure this land is around for years to come, but also how can we make it better than when we found it, right? So there we go. Sorry, guys. So dairy farming really is a family business. So whether you're, related to your fellow workers or not, you do become like family because you work together. Dairy farm is 365 days a year, all day long. But with these numbers you can see here, a lot of our dairy farms are family owned still. So within the United States, you can see they're 90% US farms in general are family farms, but even more concentrated in dairy farms that we are family owned. But we are seeing a lot of consolidation. So a lot of people say that they're like, well, it must be because farms are getting bigger in size. They must be moving away from the family style farming. Not necessarily. A lot of your family farms you see consolidating. So maybe several different families coming together, which is really, really great for quality of life for the farmer because you're able to balance out a lot of different things and everybody can kind of have their own area of expertise, which not only makes the business better, but again, it makes your quality of life and your job satisfaction better as well. And of course, our cows. So with our cows, I always like to tell people that the number one thing with cows is that they are social animals. So whenever you see a dairy farm, it's always going to be in a group setting when you're looking at the animals in the parlor or in the barn, and then they're also creatures of habit. So everything we do when we design housing, when we take care of the animals, we try to make it as consistent as possible so that they can predict everything. So having those barns where we keep the cows in, we do still graze them, and you will see that here and there, but if we're able to keep the temperatures consistent as possible, access to food, even just the time of day when we feed them and milk them the same as much as possible, our cows are the most comfortable and the most healthy. So being able to have our barns designed around that idea helps our cows stay super comfortable. And because of that, we rely on a lot of support organizations and members that are coming onto the farm, maybe not on the farm every day, to help us do that. So we have them listed here, like our veterinarian, our nutritionist, our environmental consultant, and even some state welfare programs and other voluntary programs as well. So the farm program is a really great program that farmers participate in. We basically say, hey, why don't we share all of our resources and have it all in one spot? So one, we can actively interact with the community and our consumers to say, hey, this is what we're doing and this is how we're doing it, as well as have a place for farmers to get resources on these different, very important facets of their business. So the big focal points for this program is antibiotics, our employees, the animal care, biosecurity, and the environment. So these are all really, really great areas that speak to what we're doing every day on the farm, and it can help us provide resources for the farms and provide information for consumers as well. So like we talked about, right, with our farmers, and we heard it from Stephanie, basically we have a tall order. We're trying to feed more people with less farmers, have a reduced impact on our land. So really we're utilizing technology to do that because we have less and less people coming back into farming and more people to feed. So technology really helps us be able to produce more with a lower footprint and needing less farmers, which is super helpful, which is what you can kind of see going on here. And this last graph is, this last slide is great. I love this infographic, specifically because my husband was an intern here at this farm, but it really speaks to our cows' superpowers. I know it sounds corny, and as a farmer, you're like, of course you're going to call your cows superheroes, but they really are. Because if you look, you have this cow, right? She's eating her food. She's able to turn it around and upcycle it into this awesome 13 essential nutrient product for our consumers. But it doesn't stop there. They can then take their manure, which some people might think is that waste? No, that's kind of like our liquid gold, because you can go on and run it through a digester and create energy for our local communities and the farm. You can then take the rest of that manure and spread it on the fields to grow crops for the cows or grow crops for human consumption. And then you still have a little bit left where you can even go on to create bedding for that cow. So it's a really great circularity message for our super cows and that superpower, right? Because like you think of superheroes, they all have that specific superpower. So our cows, it's their rumen. So their rumen is a specific compartment in their stomach that allows them to take certain fibers and carbohydrates that humans can't digest and actually turn it into energy. It's because of these certain bacteria and organisms that exist in there. And they're able to take byproducts, which you can see here, like orange peels and, you know, full corn plants. We're not talking just the corn kernels. We're talking the full corn plant and things like that, and be able to turn it into or upcycle it into milk, which is great. So you can see here how much we rely on our cows when we're talking about combating human food waste, as well as our you can see here that their diet is estimated at 39% byproducts in their diet. So it's keeping that out of landfills and upcycling it into food again to feed that growing population.
Thanks so much, Abby. I think cows certainly do seem to be superheroes, huh? You know, there is concern over methane emissions, though. And so, Dr. Stephanie, I'd love to kick it back over to you for this next question. Are cows a leading source of greenhouse gas emissions?
Sure. Excited to talk about this. So I think the first place to start is to recognize that greenhouse gases are unique. And because they're unique, they require different mitigation strategies. So you can see here, this is data from the EPA. So carbon dioxide makes up the majority of greenhouse gases. And really that comes from transportation, electricity, and those industries. Methane makes up about 11% of our total US greenhouse gas emissions. And that's coming from natural gas, enteric fermentation, and landfills. Now that enteric fermentation, that does relate to dairy. Fun fact, you can pull this out at your next kind of like, you know, dinner party. When we talk about enteric fermentation, guys, we're talking about cow burps, not cow farts. Those are official science terms that you can use. So when I speak about that, I'm talking about the part of the normal digestive process of cows where actually as they're digesting, they will burp out methane. The important thing to remember about greenhouse gases is they have different warming potentials. And what do I mean by that? It means how long they're staying in the atmosphere and affecting the warming. And so methane is initially kind of more damaging, but it's very short-lived. CO2 lasts a lot longer in the atmosphere. So when we look at methane, it's actually an opportunity because it's so short-lived that by doing work to minimize methane emissions, I would actually see that change in my lifetime, which is something that's really exciting to me. Additionally, it's important also to recognize that there are different carbon cycles. So when we think about fossil fuels, it's kind of a linear path where we're burning the fuels and it's going into the environment. The cow is actually part of something called a biogenic carbon cycle. And really what's happening here is you can see right in this picture, right? Carbon stored in plants. The cow eats the plants. We then have methane and carbon dioxide that's going to the atmosphere. We have photosynthesis happening. And so it's contributing as part of this cycle and not necessarily as part purely of a linear path. So really, I just kind of wanted to talk about this a little bit more about, well, where does dairy fit into this when we talk about greenhouse gases? Well, dairy actually spearheaded doing a life cycle assessment. So we were the first food ad sector that really wanted to know what is our environmental impact. We took data from well over 500 farms with a ton of different variables and basically tried to calculate out the GHG emissions intensity of fluid milk and then go ahead and estimate kind of for the entire sector. So really, what did that show us? Well, it showed us when we estimated out for the sector that it was estimated that about 2% of US greenhouse gases actually come from the dairy industry. The other really cool thing for me as a researcher is it helped point where maybe work could be done to minimize emissions. So you can see in this little graph here, it's probably hard to see, but kind of those two first bars are feed and milk production. And the rest are kind of that rest of the milk value chain. And so it showed us that the majority of our emissions are occurring prior to farm gate. So as Abby talked about, right, when that milk truck is pulling away from the farm. And so that really helps us focus on what we can do in providing options for farmers in the industry to go ahead and minimize those emissions on farm, but also still working at acknowledging emissions are happening in the rest of that value chain throughout so the whole industry can make progress. So our top GHG contributors really are that enteric methane that we're talking about, manure management as well, and then looking actually at the feed production. So kind of what does that look like? Internally, this is kind of what we think about. When we look at the farm print, we can see that about 26% comes from feed for our overall GHG contribution. We've got 33% from manure, 35% from enteric methane. Fun fact, actually, that 33% in manure, the majority of that's actually methane. And then 6% from energy. So have we kind of made progress? We have. There was a really cool study published that actually looked at what it took kind of from an environmental impact perspective to produce a gallon of milk in 2007 and compared it to what was needed to produce a gallon of milk in 2017. And you can see here in this little milk jug, what they found is actually that it required 30% less water, 21% less land, and had a decrease of 19% in greenhouse gas emissions. Also, you can go online and find on the AgStar database that there's about 279 operational anaerobic digesters in the US that are on dairy farms. There's been a ton of innovations in cattle feeding practices and technologies that are looking actually to reduce methane specifically. Remember the burps? And also that about 1 gallon of water is recycled 4 times on a farm for other purposes. So we still actually know there's work to be done. Even though we're estimated to be around 2%, there's still more we can do. And so that's why really the Innovation Center set these voluntary ambitious goals for 2050, really trying to achieve greenhouse gas neutrality, looking at optimizing water use while still maximizing that recycling, like I mentioned, and improving the water quality by making sure we're optimizing the utilization of manure and how we're managing it, as well as soil nutrients. And really, this needs to have partnership across the entire value chain. And so we break this down into 2 sections. When we focus kind of on farm, if you think back to that LCA graph I showed you, right, those first 2 bars, the farm and field, that's where this initiative comes into play, where we're looking at groundwork research. We're looking at what's actually working on farms, and we're sharing that information out with others in the industry through collective impact. And then for that rest of that chart, the processors are getting together and really trying to figure out how can they minimize their greenhouse gas emissions. They're looking at their packaging, they're looking at their waste to minimize food waste, and also how they utilize water. And you can see some of our partners on this slide that are participating in this work.
All right. Thank you so much, Stephanie. As you said, we're all doing our best to reduce our environmental footprint. So it's encouraging to see the progress from the agricultural innovation and technology, as well as the 2050 goals. And I cannot believe it. We have packed a lot of information into this webinar, and we are at our last question. So hats off to the speakers for being able to really cover this content in engaging detail. I really appreciate that. Now, when we think back to dairy in the food system, we sometimes hear that removing dairy cows from diets is the sustainable solution. Can you speak to this a little bit, Dr. Stephanie?
Absolutely. Actually love talking about this. So us as researchers actually really wanted to know the answer to this as well, right? We're curious. So we found that actually removing dairy probably isn't going to be a big solution here. There was a 2020 modeling study done that the researchers looked at if you remove dairy cows from the US food system, what would happen? And what they found is there was actually very little impact on greenhouse gas emissions, but there was actually a significant impact on our country's food supply, especially because of the nutrients. And so what they found was that there was a significant reduction in the availability of essential micronutrients like alpha-linolenic acid, calcium, vitamins A, D, B12, and choline. So that's pretty substantial. There was another study done looking at NHANES programming, where they basically said, okay, let's take dairy nutrients, try to replace that with non-dairy foods. And they said, while you can, kind of fill some of those gaps, what happens is there is a large increase in cost. You have to really increase the amount of food you're eating and increase your energy intake. Additionally, if we actually met the dietary guideline recommendations that we have, there could be a positive health and economic impact. And what do I mean by that? There was a study that was done that said, if people actually followed that 2.5 to 3 servings a day in that dietary pattern, we think back to the food system, right? Everything is connected. You'd actually see savings due to a reduction in cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, stroke, hypertension, and colorectal cancer. And really kind of the final point to talk about this, when we talk about only focusing on one part of that food system, whether it's the environment of removing it and just want to focus on that impact, or nutrition or economics, is that really they all need to be considered together when we have these discussions. You can see that from this FAO report, where really you had experts come together and they're talking about this intersection of environment and nutrition. And again, as we state, really there needs to be this discussion of trade-offs that happen within a food system. So really, I get to do the takeaway slide here, which I'm excited about. I hope by listening to this webinar, everybody really kind of comes away with that food system kind of thinking in mind, and really recognize that dairy foods are an affordable and accessible source of nutrition for American families, that farmers are innovative and they are so passionate about being stewards of the land and its resources, that dairy foods can actually play an important role in sustainable food systems. And it's by contributing to essential nutrients, reducing that burden of chronic disease, and supporting local and global economies. And also that the whole entire dairy community is really committed to improving our environmental impact and working towards environmental progress through some of those technological advances, continued research, and different initiatives.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of our speakers for bringing their insights and passion and expertise to the table. And in honor of World Milk Day and National Milk Day, I also want to thank Abbey, who's our RD dairy farmer, and all the dairy farmers out there who are committed to bringing delicious, nutritious, safe dairy products to our plate while caring for their animals and the environment. So a huge thank you to all our dairy farmers out there. I hope that you've enjoyed this webinar. If you have, we have a library of other webinars and continuing education resources to dive into. And a reminder for dietitians, you can still claim your ethics credit for our webinar on the ethics in hunger, nourishing communities in need. So be sure to check that out. Please, as we said before, use the Q&A box to ask your questions, and we'll do our best to consolidate similar ones so we can get through as many questions as possible in the time we have remaining. So I'm going to dive into the queue here and see what's popping up. Maybe first, to lead us off, Megan, I'll toss this one to you. There's quite a few questions about flavored milk and the role flavored milk can have in a healthy diet. Can you address that for us?
Sure thing. Yeah, great question. And, I hear a lot about it too in the news and headlines and things like that. So from my perspective, there are a few things that can be helpful to know about flavored milk. According to the Healthy Beverage Consumption Consensus Report, the one that I referenced earlier, flavored milk is not recommended to children before the age of 6. As we talked about before in the presentation, only water and plain pasteurized dairy milk are the recommended beverages. But after age 6, flavored milk, if consumed, it can be a part of an overall healthy dietary pattern. According to the DGA and AAP, a small amount of added sugars, which, of course, fall within the daily calorie limit, it can be used to increase the palatability and appeal of nutrient-rich foods like milk. Flavored milk offers the same high-quality protein and 13 essential nutrients that plain dairy milk does, including the 3 of 4 of public health concerns, so calcium, vitamin D, and potassium. And because it's a component of federal school meal programs, there's actually a lot of data and research on flavored milk. So I really encourage you to peruse it if you're interested. But what the research shows is that it contributes only 4% of added sugars to the overall diet for kids, and that it's actually not associated with increased BMI or adverse effects on body composition. In fact, some data suggest it can have a protective role against childhood overweight and obesity. Flavored milk's associated with higher overall milk intake and therefore higher micronutrient intake, as well as better diet quality scores overall. And, at the end of the day, it's popular among kids, and removing it decreases milk intake along with its missed nutrients and increases in food waste. And, for me as a dietitian, this leaves the question, if it's removed, what will children replace it with? If it's water or plain dairy milk, fabulous, love it. But if it leads to increased consumption of other beverages that have little to no nutrition and perhaps even more added sugar, like soft drinks, sweetened teas, energy drinks, sports drinks, it circles back to the guidance from the DGA and the AAP that, that small amount of added sugar alongside a nutritious profile can still fit in a healthy dietary pattern. So I hope that answers your question. And again, great question. I see it a lot too.
Yeah, it certainly is popular. Thank you for that perspective. And I did just want to point out, as you see in the chat, there's a link to our science summary booklet. So as Megan mentioned, perusing the research and the science, this is a great research to really dive deep into what the science says about dairy and a variety of health topics. So if you haven't checked that out, I encourage you to do so. Abby, I have a question for you. So do dairy cows receive antibiotics throughout their lives on a regular basis?
Yeah, great question. And obviously we kind of jumped through all this stuff to get it all in, but I'd love to elaborate on that. So we don't, again, as you saw on the slide, we work with a lot of people outside of the farm every day to make sure we do the best we can to take care of the cows. So one of those people is the veterinarian. So for any antibiotic we would use on the farm, we would have what we call an SOP that the veterinarian creates for the specific use of that antibiotic. And again, if they are on that antibiotic, their milk has to be discarded. It cannot go in, it cannot be commingled with the rest of the herd, and it certainly can't leave the farm as saleable milk. So really with farmers, there's a lot of incentive to be super proactive with keeping the animal as healthy as possible to avoid antibiotics, because one, that's just the cow's not feeling well, so they're not producing a lot of milk. If they have to go on antibiotics, the milk can't be sold, so we're not making money. And usually the animal needs a lot of one-on-one care, which increases our labor costs. The antibiotics themselves increases our costs because they cost money. So there's a lot of incentive to try to make sure our cows don't get sick in the first place. But if they do, and the vet, we follow that SOP, warrants that animal would benefit from utilizing whichever antibiotic that the vet recommends, then yeah, at a non-organic farm, we would do that. But they don't, it's not like every day they get some form of antibiotic. It's only if they were in a situation where their health permits it, and that's working closely with the veterinarian to do that. And again, once they have the antibiotics, we test the very individual cow's milk to make sure it is free of milk before we put her back in with the herd to then continue milking with the rest of her herd mates.
Thank you. I think it's so valuable to have the opportunity to hear this perspective of a farmer, because oftentimes we don't really understand the whole totality of the animal care and why antibiotics might be used and the impact on your overarching farm and practice and business. So thank you for bringing that to us. Kind of on a follow-up to that, we've had some questions about where do you do farm tours? And I think I can chime in for a second, and then Abby, if you want to build on that. But there are state and regional dairy councils across the United States. So wherever you live, there's likely a dairy council that's going to support you. And that can be a great place to first reach out to get connected for dairy farm tours. And I think these can be really impactful for university classes, college classes, dietetic internships, and others that want to do a deep dive into farming and sustainable food systems. And Abby, I don't know if you have anything to add on that front.
Yeah, one thing I was going to say, in our great day and age of technology, you don't even have to physically go to the farm. If you want to start off with maybe a virtual farm tour, a lot of these regional checkoff dairy programs have social media platforms that can direct you towards different virtual tour options they have, or pre-recorded ones. And then of course, if you are in some type of a program where there's one going on locally, they would advertise that if that, was appropriate. And, but yeah, I do encourage people to get to know the farmers in their community. Now, with farmers in community, a lot of times we do not recommend just showing up and walking onto the farm, because that's, a place of business and we are taking care of live animals and we have biosecurity concerns. But definitely going through our checkup programs as our gatekeeper to be able to set that up and be able to organize stuff like that is a great way to be able to learn more about farming. So I definitely encourage people to do that.
Fantastic. As we close it out, Megan, I did want to share one very popular question with you. This is just one that represents several that came over. So several of my clients with acne have been told not to drink milk, as drinking milk will cause acne to flare. I did look this up in some dermatology journals, and found info to support this notion. However, I didn't critically review the journal articles. What's the truth about milk and acne?
Yeah, no, really good question. And this is a pretty complicated topic because acne is particularly multifaceted. It's affected by things like diet, hormones, age, makeup, hygiene, things like that. But it's important because it's so common and it's so uncomfortable. And yeah, hey, most of us have been there, right? So many of us can relate. When I consider this question, I often reference the clinical guidelines published by the American Academy of Dermatology. And what they said is that when it comes to diet, emerging evidence suggests that high glycemic index foods and dietary patterns might be linked to acne. And as far as dairy foods, yes, there is limited evidence to suggest that skim milk may influence acne as well. But the guidelines do state that the quality and strength of evidence is limited and inconsistent because it's mostly based on observational data and no clinical trials. So based on the evidence, the Academy concluded that at this time, there are no specific dietary changes recommended for the management of acne. But as I mentioned before about lactose intolerance, I think it's really important for us as clinicians to listen and validate what our patients are experiencing, right? So perhaps dietary recalls can highlight potential cues. If the diet's high in high glycemic index foods, I'd say that's a better place to start based on the strength of evidence. And from there, you can work on other food groups like dairy, assuming they're also working with a dermatologist regarding the other factors that could influence skin health as well. But great question.
Thank you so much. We are at time, but Abby, I have one other question I want to pose to you, if you don't mind staying over for a second.
That's okay.
So one of the points that was mentioned that we would learn in this webinar was to identify processing practices to ensure animal well-being, but I didn't catch anything about that beyond the state of the living quarters. Can you please share how cow well-being is demonstrated from birth through processing?
Yeah, so first of all, the farm program that I mentioned on the one slide, a lot of co-ops have a specific representative that works and is on staff at those co-ops that are required to come and do inspections on the farm specifically geared towards animal welfare. So we do have third parties coming on the farm to double check that stuff. It's like another checkpoint that we have. But in addition to that, again, there's a huge incentive for farmers to make sure that cows are comfortable, because if our cows are getting what they need, their milk production will follow. So in the order of bodily need priorities, milk kind of comes last. So if that cow isn't doing, if she's not in tip-top condition and feeling awesome and amazing, the first thing that's going to change is her milk production. So that actually is super helpful in helping us know if she's not feeling well. But in addition to that, it's incentive for our farmers to make sure that everything is going well. So we rely a lot on those outside parties to be able to come in and give us the current science on what temperature cows like to be at all year round, what age is the most appropriate to start vaccine protocols, how to group them when we transition them to new pens, how to group them so that they have the least amount of stress as possible. We even have science on milking procedures and what makes them the most comfortable so that they can let down their milk using their bodily responses versus, just relying on the milking machine. So there's a lot of science tied up in not only making sure our farm is working efficiently, but also that the cows are as comfortable as possible. So it's kind of like the sky's the limit. Every little minute thing with our cows is taken into consideration to make sure that they are comfortable and healthy.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all our participants. As we were pulling together this webinar, the panelists noted, we could do a full webinar on each one of these topics, full dissertation per slide. So I really appreciate the amount of effort and passion that you put into it, as well as the participants for bringing forth these questions that really shaped the webinar. So thanks so much. Just as a reminder, participants will be receiving the continuing education certificates within 24 hours of this webinar, and the full webinar recording will be available next week at usdairy.com. Thanks again, and have a fantastic day and enjoy National Dairy Month.